Jesus is King. Welcome back to Jews, Judaism, and Israel on the Meaning of Catholic. This is a series all about 3,000, 4,000 plus years of the history of the Jews and Israel. And today we have retired Lieutenant Colonel Mr. Gary Taphorn with us. Mr. Taphorn, thank you so much for joining us on the show, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Mr. Taphorn is, we're going to get a little bit more of your biography in just a minute. But this series is, as I said, we're going through all this history, but today we're going to delve a little bit deeper into a lot of the modern question, particularly about the modern state of Israel. So today's presentation by the retired Lieutenant Colonel is going to look at some of the history of the modern state of Israel, and then we'll also get Mr. Taphorn's commentary, which is a critical Catholic analysis of Zionism, its theology, and various aspects of it. So, if you want all of those different lectures and classes and interviews about all these different questions about Israel, Jews, all sorts of different things, you have to become a guild member at meaningofcatholic.com/register. And I want to point everyone to Mr. Taphorn's articles. And so, but first, Mr. Taphorn, can you tell us a little bit about your work in the military and your what you gained as a Middle Eastern analyst? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, Timothy, I was really privileged by the Army to have the opportunity to work in the Middle East. I was commissioned way back in 1972 as a field artillery officer. And at about the 10-year mark or so in my career, I was given the chance to move into a different specialty. And one of those specialties that the Army offers is what's called Foreign Area Officer, where they make you a so-called specialist. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I was for many years in the Army a specialist in the Middle East, which meant getting a master's degree. Mine was at Georgetown University, learning Arabic. I certainly can't speak fluently anymore, but I've learned enough Arabic so that I can't forget most of it. And and above all, I was assigned for 3 tours of duty in the Middle East, 2 in Egypt, 1 in Jordan. I've also traveled throughout the Middle East. I've visited almost every country there. I can recall being in Iraq in 1988 when the total number of Americans in Iraq was something like 7 or 8. So I've been around. I've learned quite a bit. I've traveled to Israel, I believe 4 times for a total of perhaps 2 months. I was also in my stateside tours, I was assigned to United States Central Command, which is in Tampa, responsible to the Secretary of Defense for all Middle East actions and activities. And also had a tour in the Pentagon where I was within the policy shop, I was if you want to say, the advisor to the Secretary of Defense on a number of Middle East countries over a period of another 3 years. So I've been privileged, and I really do mean that. It's a privilege to speak about the Middle East kind of from the inside out. I've had many discussions over the years with people in State Department, other federal agencies, and I feel as though I've been able to bring a lot of expertise to the table, and because my Catholic faith remains primary for me more than anything else, as you've already indicated in your previous program, Catholics should have a lot of problems with Zionism, and I'm hopefully able to capture some of those problems here for you and your students here today.
Well, thank you, sir. And so you were analyzing the Middle East from all these geopolitical perspectives, but obviously you always had the Catholic faith behind you, even if you weren't, preaching that to the Pentagon and whatnot. I'm sure you
Right.
were in your own way, but Tell us a little bit about these articles you have at Catholic Family News. They were recently reprinted in the print editions, and that's how I learned about it in the print editions here. But
Right.
you can click on the link below to access all these articles at the Catholic Family News website. So tell us anything to preview why should people go and read these articles.
Yeah, well, I've written a number of things for Catholic Family News over the years, but I really began back in 2015 and 2016. The item that you're pointing at there, why is there a Gaza Strip? That was my first article, and it was relatively extensive, so it was broken up into three parts. And the theme of why is there a Gaza Strip all goes back to the land. If you take the history of the Jews all the way back to the time of Moses and the Exodus, the land of Palestine, or the Holy Land, was a part of God's covenant, an integral part of God's covenant. And it's because the Jews disabused that ultimately they were tossed out of the Holy Land, not once but twice. Second time being right after the life of Christ. Uh, and so that focuses on the Zionist part um, of the equation, if you will. So that, again, there's three separate articles. The second piece was written a year later, 2016, and consists of five parts. And you can see the title there, Christian Zionism, America's Dance with the Devil. And the two articles are designed to be complementary. In other words, the first article deals with the Jews, the Zionists, and it's just historical in nature, so it runs basically 2,500 years or so in length, but obviously focusing on current day. And then the second angle focuses far more on the West, the Americans and the British, who basically created and promoted this thing called Christian Zionism. So the two are meant to be a pair. They're meant to be thought of as two sides of the same coin. And as a very well-known British analyst once said, you cannot ignore the Christian Zionists because for every Zionist, implying a Jewish Zionist, there are somewhere between 10 and 20 Christian Zionists in the West. And without the support and the advocacy of Christian Zionists over the years, Israel would never have gotten off the ground. There would be no such thing as Israel today. So you have to look at both sides of the same coin.
Excellent. So you've prepared a presentation based on your analysis over many decades of being employed with the U.S. government, analyzing these things, and we're going to introduce some of the history today, all the way up to the 67 or so today.
Right. This will take us from the really the turn of the century in the 1900s, early 1900s, up to 1967.
Excellent.
Which I consider kind of like the high watermark of the Israeli experience. And then
Excellent.
in our follow-on program, we'll take it from 67 up to current day.
Excellent. Okay. So yeah, so Mr. Taphorn is coming back next week. We're going to go from 67 to the present next week to really delve deep into a basic historical introduction. So without any further ado, would you like to tell us about the terminology?
Sure. It's very important when you deal with the Middle East to realize that you're dealing with people who have an ethnic heritage, they have a religion, they have a nationality, and they might even have an ideology. And so the terms that have evolved over the years um, are really, even though they're not specific, it's quite easy to get them confused one with another. So just as a way to make sure all of our students are on the same track here, I tried to indicate the differences in those four different types of terminology. So, from the ethnic perspective, a person can be a Jew or an Arab, or there's plenty of other ethnic backgrounds in the Middle East, like the Kurds, for example. But Jew and Arab are principally ethnic terms. The second term we can use are religious terms, and of course, Jew also fits there. Although within the Jewish, say even within Israel, there's so many different types of Jews, just like there's many different types of Christians and so forth. But when you hear the term Jew, Muslim, or Christian, it's meant strictly in a religious context. The third type of terminology, and it's the only example I can think of, is Zionist. And Zionist is strictly ideological or political. Um, it I'll just leave it at that. The Arabs have no counterpart to that, except that they're anti-Zionists. Let's leave it at that. And then the fourth and final type would be a nationalist terminology, which implies citizenship. And in Israel, obviously, people like to refer to themselves as Israelis. But you can be a Jew without being a Zionist. You can be a Zionist without being an Israeli. And you can be an Israeli without being a Jew. For example, Palestinian Israelis. About 20% of Israel's population is Palestinian. But what about the Palestinians who don't have Israeli citizenship? And that's the vast majority of them, those on the West Bank and Gaza and so forth. What are they supposed to do for a nationality? These are the people that have lived in Israel the longest, that can date their heritage in Israel back maybe 2 and 3 centuries in some cases, but yet they have no citizenship today that is recognized by the governing authority, namely the government of Israel. So, and if the Israelis have their say in the matter, the Palestinians will never get that right of citizenship because the Israelis oppose a two-state solution. So just a brief term there about terminology there.
And just a question here, in terms of ethnicity, most of the Christians in Israel are either Palestinian or basically non-Jewish, like they're Italians or other ethnicities who live there, right, and take care of sacred
Right.
sites, right?
Right. Well, there's quite a few expatriates who live in Israel. They're there for work, basically. But for the so-called native Christians, to or native to native Christians, they're essentially all Palestinians.
Okay, so the
Um,
vast majority of Christians in Israel are Palestinian, or Palestinians would consider themselves Arabs.
right.
Arabic
And
is
we
their
use the
first language.
term right, and we use the term Christian loosely too, because I believe the majority of those Christians are actually Catholic. Some are not, some are Protestant. There are Lutherans, there are Anglican Christians as well. But for our purposes here, let's just refer to all of them uh, as Christian.
Okay.
And of course, keep in mind that over the years, since the beginning of Israel, the number of Christians as a percent of the population has dropped dramatically because the Palestinians as a whole see there's no future for them um, in Israel. The laws and the policies are cooked against them, and their opportunities to make a good living for their family, to get a good education and so forth are severely limited. So over the years, many Palestinian Christians have left. Likewise, Muslims as well, but the Christians tend to be better educated, and therefore there are more opportunities for them abroad.
Yeah, I happen to live in the state that houses one of the biggest populations of Arabs outside the Middle East in Michigan, nearby you as well. So Pizza Balla, the Latin patriarch of Jerusalem, is an Italian, I believe.
Right.
Pizza Bolla.
It's,
I
it's
guess I
about,
guess it's kind of obvious. Pizza Bolla, and then there's also the Hebrew Catholics, and I think most of them are born outside the state of Israel. But I think, they're like Jewish ethnicity, baptized Catholics, and that's an interesting thing as well. But that's
right.
outside the scope. Anyways,
Exactly. Yeah.
moving on. Go ahead.
So because we're talking about Zionists, and I've arbitrarily said that Zionists refer just to Jews. That's strictly my own interpretation. Many Christians would call themselves Zionists, but for the sake of argument, I categorize Christian Zionists in a separate category here. So in this series here, we're going to be primarily focusing on the Jewish Zionists. And we'll talk about people like Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, and others. Most of those men, actually, there's one woman in there, Golda Meir, who hails from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and along her way to becoming a prime minister of Israel. But most of those men in there were military men and became prime ministers of Israel. So those are names that our students should generally be familiar with because they're just common knowledge in the Middle East. On the right side, you have what I call the Christian Zionists. And you notice I put two flags up there because Christian Zionism really began with John Nelson Darby in England. And along the way, it spread to the United States. People like William Blackstone and a number of others that I write about in my articles became huge advocates for Zionism way back even in the late 1800s. I also mentioned Arthur Balfour in there, a former Prime Minister of England when he issued the Balfour Declaration. I can notice that most of the rest are either American presidents or American evangelists, the evangelists being Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, John Hagee. Falwell has died. I think Pat Robertson may have died. I'm not sure, but the premier televangelist of the current day among the Christian Zionists is John Hagee, and he's getting way up there in age. I also showed two presidents, Bush and Trump. Trump seems to have pushed Zionism to a new level in the White House here. I don't think we've had any president as pro-Zionist as he is. And you'll notice I have a question mark next to Reagan because I'm really not sure about him. He clearly was a fan of Israel. He liked to dabble in end times theory and prophecy. But when it came time to policy, Reagan didn't treat Israel any different than anybody else. He was much more objective than Bush or Trump. But this brings up an issue with Christian Zionism. It's not really a religion. It's not a church, and it's not a state. So it doesn't have a constitution. It doesn't have a creed. You can be a Roman Catholic and be a Christian Zionist like Marco Rubio. You can be I guess, a hardcore Protestant evangelical, like a Ted Cruz or a Tom Cotton. But that makes it maddeningly hard to pin down. When you say Christian Zionism, it probably means something different to almost everybody you talk to. And that's part of the problem that we face when we try to get our arms around this. So let's go ahead and begin our presentation here. And a good background, a good point of departure for us would be a map of the Middle East around the year 1900. This was in the final days of the Ottoman Empire before it collapsed. But this map could just as easily reflect the Middle East in 1800 or 1700 or 1600. It was very stable for a number of centuries there, with the Ottomans being the kingpin. And notice the areas that were controlled by the Ottomans. You can see running all the way across North Africa from Algiers to Cairo, and then the Arabian Peninsula, and then into the Balkans area, Hungary, the Crimea, all the Balkan states such as Serbia and the others, Bosnia and the other states, although they had started to break off by 1900. But then the core of the Middle East is the area in Syria in Palestine and Iraq. That's what's known as the Fertile Crescent, probably the most ancient part of known human civilization. And that's where we're going to focus our efforts here in this class. So about the year 1900, the fate of the Ottoman Empire was already well known or well anticipated. It had been called by many Europeans the sick man of Europe. It was in decline and in a huge state of corruption, financial and cultural corruption. It really started probably in the 1700s, but certainly by the time of Napoleon in the early 1800s. What you see here is a cartoon from the British magazine Punch, dated 1896, which shows the Ottoman Sultan on the far right there, not looking very happy while his empire is being torn apart by the British in the center and also the Austrians on the left. So as the Ottomans began to decline, they were leaving a vacuum all over the Middle East, but especially in the area of Palestine and Syria. And there were three outside forces, well, it's actually two outside forces and one inside force that were attempting to fill that vacuum, that power vacuum. First were the Europeans, as shown on this cartoon here. The British and the French, as well as the Austrians and the Russians, were craving Ottoman territories. The British, in particular, had a desire to take over the Suez Canal, which at one point they had, although they did not build the Suez Canal, they did own it briefly. The Arabs, for their part, they wanted independence. They were watching what was happening in Europe, and they said, there's no reason why we need to be a colony of some other people. We're looking for independence and nationalism as well. And then the third force, the other outside force, were the Zionists, who began to anticipate a homeland for themselves in Palestine. So this is why the era of about 1900, really from about 1890 up through the end of World War I, this is why this period is so important to analyze and look at. It was a period of terrible, terrible turmoil in the Middle East, and Palestine was kind of like the ground zero of all this activity. So the Zionists had been they had been in existence at a very low and informal level since about the 1860s. One of the great early Zionists was a man named Moses Hess. Another Zionist was Nathan Birnbaum, who gave the name Zionism. He coined the name for that movement. But the one Zionist that most people will remember, he came along a little later than the other ones, was Theodor Herzl. Herzl was an Austrian Jew, very well educated, reasonably wealthy, became a journalist by trade. And when he was in France, covering the trial of was
The Dreyfus affair.
the Dreyfus affair. Yeah, Dreyfus was a Jewish army officer in the French military who was set up to be the scapegoat